The Thursday, April 28th, 2016 meeting of the Water Quality Management Committee will come to order. We are all here but one who had an academic meeting to go to, and so isn't with us. But today we're going to pull ourselves away from nitrogen reduction in estuaries for a bit and hear a little bit about other things that are going on in the oceans and in the estuaries. And we're going to hear about it from Jenny Rubin from the Woodsville Oceanographic Institution, who has recently gotten a lot of publicity for her work on ocean acidification and temperature rise. So we saw that and thought it was something that ought to be part of our conversation. And we asked her to come, and she came. So Jenny, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'm Jenny Rubin. I did my undergraduate and master's degree at the University of Virginia. So I came up here a couple of years ago. I work in marine chemistry and geochemistry, same as Matt for Scott Doney. We largely do sort of global climate modeling, data synthesis, also satellite data analyses. So some of this work that you're going to hear about today reflects a number of different topics, but you're not getting away from nitrogen so easily, actually. I'm going to be talking a bunch about that today as well, so just sort of not an unfamiliar topic, I'm sure, for you guys. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about climate and water quality changes in Buzzards Bay, both historical changes and potential future changes. Of course, before I actually keep going, this work would not be possible without a number of people who are all listed up there: Shauna Williamson, Maria Kavanaugh, Joe Costa, David Glover, Rachel Jakuba, Dan McCorkle, Chris Neal, Tony Williams, and of course Scott Downey. Yeah, so just a little bit of very brief background. I wasn't entirely sure which of the topics that we're working on, which are relevant to this, that you guys wanted to hear about. So you're going to hear briefly about 4 different projects that we have going on, all related to sort of the interactions between climate, water quality, and ocean acidification. But just a little bit of brief background. The National Climate Assessment provided a really great sort of century-scale record of change across the U.S. and just some really neat things to look at. This is temperature change across the U.S., but the Northeast really has been an area of very rapid warming, or of a high degree of warming over the last century. If you look at precipitation patterns, that's what you're seeing here. Greener colors are wetter, browner colors are drier. The Northeast also has been getting wetter over the last century. And if you look at their assessment of sort of high frequency rainfall events, they are becoming more frequent and more intense as well. So there's really been a lot of change in this region when we think about climate drivers like warming and precipitation patterns, which sort of led us to think about, well, how might this influence local water quality, and also how might these change into the future. So if you look at, the National Climate Assessment was a very land-based assessment, but if you look at more recent analyses that have been done on the oceans, if you look at oceanic temperatures, there was a really nice study that came out last year by Andy Pershing, which was focused more on the cod fishery, but what they found was that regionally the Gulf of Maine, the sort of southern New England and Gulf of Maine area, is in the top 1% in terms of warming. Oceanic warming around the world. So it's quite rapid, and what's interesting is that sort of over the last several decades, it's kind of hard to see that scale, but the plot on the left showing the Gulf of Maine from that study starts in the mid-80s. The sort of overall rate of warming is quite rapid, but if you look over the last decade or so, it's increased by almost an order of magnitude over just this short period of time. And I've pulled out from the satellite record, the data just from the mouth of Buzzards Bay, so that would be the most relevant data to sort of the Falmouth estuaries in this region. And you can see, of course, not surprisingly, we see the same pattern in Buzzards Bay, or close to Buzzards Bay, as you would for the broader region.
Where do you think the mouth of Buzzards Bay is? Are you talking about the hole of Woods Hole?
No, so I don't have I can probably go to a map of Buzzards Bay, but sort of the middle between the islands and sort of the mainland of
across the bottom.
Cuttyhunk.
Yeah, pretty much Cuttyhunk, in between Cuttyhunk
and New Bedford,
and New Bedford, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the issue with using sort of the long-term satellite record to look at Buzzards Bay or Buzzards Bay's estuaries is the spatial scale is quite large. The satellite sees at a sort of 7-kilometer pixel resolution, and so you can't really see into any of those estuaries, and there's very few pixels inside of Buzzards Bay itself. Newer satellites have much higher resolution, so we can look at sort of more recent data, but to go back as far as the 80s, you don't have that much resolution. So that's why I say looking at the mouth of Buzzards Bay. So the 4 projects that I'm going to talk about are historical changes in water quality, sort of the interactions between regional warming, nitrogen loading, which you guys are of course familiar with, and the resulting water quality, potential projected future changes in regional temperatures, and then finally some work on ocean acidification and water quality interactions that we have that are ongoing right now. So I will give you a preface. These different projects are sort of in varying states of completeness, so you'll see some that have been published and some that are on their way to being published and some that are still data are being collected right now. Okay, so the first project I'm going to talk about is the historical changes in water quality around Buzzards Bay. Now, some of this, of course, you guys are certainly familiar with many of the Falmouth estuaries the data that we looked at, but it's the sort of regional patterns are quite interesting as well. So this, we're fortunate enough to get some funding from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation to work with the Buzzards Bay Coalition, who I'm sure you all are very familiar with the work that they do, to help them analyze their historical water quality data, but also to help expand their sampling program to include measurements on sort of the shoulder seasons where they didn't have any data before. Like I said, I'm sure you're familiar with the program, but just a brief background in case you're not. They maintain a citizen science water quality monitoring program that's been collecting data since 1992 from roughly 200 locations every year around Buzzards Bay. Their volunteers go out from roughly late May to early September and measure the sort of standard water quality indicator suite, so that's temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and Secchi depth, about once a week. And then 4 times a summer, they're out measuring, they collect water samples twice in July and twice in August that are sent to a lab for processing for nutrient chemistry. So where have they sampled? So this is all the sampling locations that have been visited over the lifetime of the program, which is over 340 actually places. Actually, I think now, including, I think it might be up to 360, I'm not sure, but that's quite a lot, especially if you're considering many of these places are all sampled at the same time, on the same day, every other week or so. One of the challenges that we ran into with this analysis that we were doing is we were really interested in, less interested in sort of a within estuary patterns, because as you know, I'm sure, there's quite a lot of variability within a given estuary, but more interested in sort of the regional scale perspective and looking at what's going on around the whole Buzzards Bay region. So we ran into a challenge because this program has expanded over time since its inception. And often it was expanded to include more sites in places that had worse water quality. So if you were looking at sort of the long-term trends of what's going on here, the addition of new sites later on in the time series can bias some of those trends simply just by sampling in worse places. Also, each estuary has very different water quality, as I'm sure you guys know, based on the sort of land use and relative degree of development and wastewater treatment that happens in a given place. So we had to analyze each estuary sort of individually, but also pick our sites that we looked at very carefully. So of those 330 some odd sites that were sampled, we chose about 140 of them, I think, based on the length of time that each of those sites were sampled. So in order for us to do it, they had to be sampled over roughly the full time series. Then we broke up each of those, the whole group of sites, into their individual estuary units to look at sort of the different water quality around Buzzards Bay. So you're looking at 17 estuaries that we analyzed. The different colors, which are kind of hard to see, are representing those different estuaries. We did a simple, so this data set really hadn't been rigorously analyzed yet, so we did sort of just a simple long-term trend analysis, and also we looked at some of the spatial patterns among the different estuaries. So this is a plot from Sippican Harbor, which I guess is not relevant to Falmouth, but is number 9 on that, if you can see up in the sort of top left part of that Buzzards Bay. And this is just an example of what the data looked like. So as I said, we really weren't interested in within an individual estuary, although that is certainly interesting to look at. So we simply took the average of all of the data within a given estuary for that particular year and looked at how sort of annual water quality changed over the full time series. So the top plot, you're looking at temperature from Sippican Harbor. The middle is total nitrogen concentration, and the bottom is chlorophyll, and that's on a log scale, just so you know for reference. And what we thought was particularly interesting was that there was a considerable warming over this 22-year time series that we looked at. Nitrogen, the total nitrogen of pool really didn't change all that much on average, but chlorophyll increased, more than doubled over the full time series, which we thought was very interesting. And if you looked across all of these different estuaries, so now instead of, what you're looking at here is the slope of all of those trends. The red triangles are indicating a statistically significant increasing trend, and the black dots are indicating no trend at all. And the size of that dot indicates the magnitude of the slope, so how fast it's changing. What we found was that pretty much across almost every estuary around Buzzards Bay, there was warming, which is not really interesting, but not surprising given what we know about sort of the regional patterns in oceanic temperatures. What we found for Sippican Harbor was true in a number of places around Buzzards Bay where total nitrogen concentration really didn't change in many places. So of the 17 estuaries we analyzed, I think 7 increased in total nitrogen. Many of those are very obvious as to why that happened. For example, West Falmouth Harbor, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with, many of the issues. But others, there hasn't been as much sort of a time series analysis of what's really gone on in terms of the nitrogen loading into those places. But if you looked at chlorophyll, the pattern was quite striking and very similar to that of the temperature record rather than that of the total nitrogen pool that was available, where most estuaries had increases in chlorophyll, and most estuaries in fact doubled or more than doubled in chlorophyll concentration over the 22 years. So we would argue that this is perhaps related to the warming that's observed. There's a number of different reasons that could be why in terms of phytoplankton speciation or altered grazing pressure or just simply aliasing the timing of seasonal things that might happen earlier or later in the system with the relevant warming. But sort of this type of analysis is a little bit circumstantial. So when we looked at the spatial patterns among or across the different estuaries, we found another striking pattern. Now you're looking at total nitrogen on the X and chlorophyll concentration on the Y-axis. We found there was a strong relationship between nitrogen and chlorophyll, which is not particularly surprising since chlorophyll is part of the total nitrogen pool. But what we did think was pretty interesting was that there was an offset in this relationship over time. So if you look across all the estuaries, and I've averaged here the data across the first half and the last half of the time series, just so you can see the scattering of data, so you can see sort of the pattern. But if you looked at individual years, this would also be clear as well. But what we found was that during the first decade of this time series, the yield of chlorophyll per unit nitrogen that was available is lower than that in the second half of the time series. And again, we'd argue this would be related to warming, but we're missing some of the pieces of evidence to really prove that as a sort of causal relationship rather than just a correlation.
For the amateurs among us, could you explain the relationship between chlorophyll and nitrogen?
Sure, absolutely. So nitrogen is a limiting nutrient for phytoplankton or other primary producers in these coastal systems. Nitrogen makes up part of chlorophyll, so as part of the composition of chlorophyll, there is nitrogen in it. Chlorophyll is also an indicator of phytoplankton abundance, which has phytoplankton have nitrogen as part of their cellular structure. So relating chlorophyll to nitrogen, you're sort of relating something that makes up part of that pool already. Hopefully that helped.
Can I add just a sort of a thought about that?
Yeah.
So in some ways what you're saying is you have a total amount of, say, dissolved inorganic nitrogen, and that is in the second half of this decade increasing the amount of actual algae that's growing?
Maybe. It's hard to tell from the data that we have. If you look at the inorganic nitrogen, really didn't change all that much. Inorganic nitrogen concentrations around Buzzards Bay really haven't changed in many places. West Falmouth is one of the places where it has, but most of the other estuaries, it's fairly consistent. Some places it might have gone up a little bit, but mostly not changing at all.
And West Falmouth probably did because of the wastewater.
Exactly, because of the wastewater treatment plant.
Okay.
So there's sort of a classic rule of thumb that for every 10 degrees of temperature you raise the temperature, you double the rate of biological reactions. So, we're not seeing in 10 degrees, but that's where the idea of the correlation from temperature to increase in algal growth would come from.
Yes, sure. Would you mind going to a microphone, just so that our nationwide TV audience can hear you?
I'm just talking about the same view. I'm Brenda Olson, and I'm here representing Falmouth Water Stewards. And so what I'm going to ask about this, what you're explaining is, so the measurement of chlorophyll, the measurement of nitrogen doesn't include the nitrogen that's in chlorophyll.
It does.
It does, yes.
Okay, so I don't really understand why the chlorophyll can double and the nitrogen is stable.
Right, that's the question that we would love to answer, that we unfortunately don't have enough data to actually answer. So there's a number of reasons why that could happen. It could be because there's different species of phytoplankton that are here now that weren't here before, and perhaps those new species can use other forms of nitrogen than what the species that used to be here originally were able to use, and so maybe they can grow much more abundantly under sort of similar conditions, or maybe they have just simply more chlorophyll in a given cell than other species that used to be here. It's also possible that because of the warming that we've seen, that maybe something that happened in September is now happening in August, and so there's sort of an aliasing, so things that happened later are now showing up in the data that always were there, but maybe now they're showing up earlier in the season. So there's a lot of sort of things that could be going on, and unfortunately with these simple water quality measurements, we don't have enough to really say exactly why this is happening. But we can show that it is, for some reason, it is happening.
Thanks.
Great. Steve?
Is it fair to ask that, in other words, if nitrogen goes up, chlorophyll goes up because chlorophyll eats nitrogen?
Yes.
But now the chlorophyll isn't going up as much as nitrogen goes up.
No, chlorophyll is going up faster than nitrogen is.
Okay. So something else that uses nitrogen isn't going up.
Or other species of phytoplankton are now using more nitrogen, or are able to use nitrogen pools that weren't available previously. So as an example, have you heard of the rusty tide blooms that have been happening here recently? So since about 2005, people have been noticing what they're calling rusty tide blooms, which is a harmful algae, a species of harmful algae. That particular species is able to bloom in sort of unusual conditions because it can use part of the organic nitrogen pool. It can eat nitrogen and metabolize organic nitrogen, whereas many other species are not able to do that. They're only able to use the inorganic nitrogen pool. And so perhaps because this rusty tide species now, it's been present and it's been noticed every year since 2005, essentially. It's a very warm water loving species also. Now that the evidence of this particular species, Cochleodinium polycricoides, is anecdotal at this point. We don't have phytoplankton speciation data to look at, but that's something we could argue as perhaps what might be going on. But it's hard to say, with any confidence other than there's we see this correlation, but it's hard to diagnose exactly why with the data that we have.
I'm just wondering, could it be in part too that nitrogen, as we found, is a limiting factor in the estuaries and therefore in Buzzards Bay? It could be that there's a certain percentage of the nitrogen that would be utilized, and as that goes up, or as it becomes available, you get more growth.
Yeah, that's entirely possible as well.
That seems to be that, but they could still control the nitrogen concentration overall because of the level.
Sure. Also, the sort of affinity for nitrogen, so how well phytoplankton species take up nitrogen is also dependent on temperature. When water's warmer, they take it up faster and better. than they do when water is cooler. So it's also possible that the increases in uptake rates by increasing water temperatures might be driving some of this as well. So there's a number of different possibilities, which unfortunately we don't have a lot of data to really tease apart exactly why this is going on. There's another avenue of evidence which would be interesting to look at, although again, we don't have the data. If you guys are familiar with ctenophores, the little jelly zooplankton, ctenophores also tend to bloom more regularly when water temperatures are warmer. Those are very strong grazers. They eat a lot of the sort of lower zooplankton, which then essentially reduces the amount of grazing that happens on the phytoplankton. So you can get these cascades of changes that happen at different levels in the trophic system that can influence, what's going on sort of the base level. That, we don't have the data to really be able to diagnose that, but it's another possibility of what could be going on, all related to warming temperatures.
And it could be different every year or so.
It could be different every year, exactly.
Interesting.
But sort of the thing that we like to talk about is what's the implication of this? Why is this change important to consider? And the reason is, if you were sort of using this relationship between nitrogen and chlorophyll as an empirical way to say, okay, well, if I have an estuary that's located there on that relationship, and I do all these measures to reduce nitrogen, you would expect to see, if the response was staying constant over time, rather than being dynamic and changing over time, like what we've seen in our data, that you would expect to see, okay, I reduce nitrogen and I improve the water quality. Well, if that is dynamic and this relationship is changing and you reduce nitrogen, perhaps you don't see a change in water quality because there's more chlorophyll for a given amount of nitrogen now than there used to be. Or if you did nothing, maybe things get a lot worse. So, it's just something that we like to talk about and have people consider, is that these sort of relationships that are governing how these estuaries are responding to pollution are not static over time, and they can change and need to be reevaluated regularly.
So we could be doing all of this, and perhaps the outcome is to not make anything any worse.
Exactly, and which is sort of a very sad and unfortunate outcome to think about. If you put all this funding and all this infrastructure in place to really help improve things, and the outcome is, well, it could have been worse.
Wait a second, though. That arrow that goes northwest is never going to happen. There's another arrow that goes southwest from the upper red to the lower red.
Sure.
That might happen, or with warming, or the lower dashed arrow would happen if there wasn't warming.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Are you making a statement or asking a question?
I'm asking a question. We're either going to be on the blue curve or the red curve.
Or somewhere in between.
Or somewhere.
Yes, but on some curve parallel to those.
Sure, yes.
So our actions move us down whichever curve we're on.
Right. Well, so the
I'm saying
point...
it's not fair to compare.
Well, no, so the point, I'll stand up and point... Oh, do I have a pointer? Is this
Yep.
Oh, excellent, I don't need to stand up. So if you actually look at this dot right here, which is representing some estuary, is at a lower nitrogen concentration than this one. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that if this sort of hypothetical nitrogen concentration here is the same as this hypothetical nitrogen concentration here.
But the chlorophyll response is
Right.
different.
Nitrogen's on the bottom.
Right,
But
so
it
nitrogen
almost
is...
makes it look like we shouldn't do anything because we'd be making it worse.
Well,
which isn't true.
So the point is, if here would be the same nitrogen, so say you left nitrogen loading exactly the same over time, and this response is changing, then it gets a lot worse.
Right.
Right, so the point is not necessarily that the work that you're doing or that any town or management committee does to help reduce nitrogen pollution isn't helping. But it's just to consider the fact that these relationships are dynamic and may change over time, and it may look like you haven't done anything when really there's been a lot of effort and a lot of work that's been done to help improve it, and things could have been worse.
Matt and Ron?
So, just
All
to
right.
clarify, so the driving factor here is the temperature.
That's,
Is
yes.
increasing
Yep.
in the estuaries. So we can blame global warming on a problem in our estuaries.
On some of the problems, sure.
No, I was just wondering, if this is the case, and if we had more grazers in the system that were pulling out phytoplankton, like shellfish, and it would help with burial of this material and denitrification possibly, which is being measured now in the sediments. That would be possibly an important intervention in addition to the
Absolutely.
other
So
things,
the
yeah.
addition of other grazers and filter feeders into
Yeah.
these systems can help really sort of reduce what's going on. Although I'm not as familiar with that literature as well. I don't know sort of what would need to be there, had the sort of abundance of these that would need to be there. I suspect it's probably a pretty high number of oysters or clams or something that's being grown in these areas that would really need to draw down the whole sort of phytoplankton pool in an
Right.
estuary, especially because there's quite a bit of connectivity between estuaries around Buzzards Bay. There was a really nice study that was done actually this past year, I think it just came out at the beginning of the year, that looked at larval transport scallop larval transport around the different estuaries of Buzzards Bay using high-resolution modeling. And they found that there was sort of several regions of Buzzards Bay that were extremely well connected, but many of the estuaries are fairly connected across. So some things that happen in one place may also happen in another place simply because of hydrological transport that goes on. So some things that happen in one place are very relevant to those that happen in others.
So the obvious question is, have you talked to Brian House, or is he aware of this?
I have not spoken with Brian Howes. I don't know if he's aware of this yet. I've been in touch with Jeff Turner a bit, who's done some work in Buzzards Bay as well, some water quality monitoring work in Buzzards Bay, but I haven't talked with Brian. I've been working very collaboratively with Joe Costa from the Buzzards Bay National Estuary Program. I suspect incorporating some of these results or some of these ideas into the MEP report specifically would be really interesting and would be really neat to do. But I haven't talked to Brian at any point. Yep.
Thanks.
Right, so that's one study that we had published this past year in January. The second study is now that I'm going to talk about is work that's getting ready to be submitted on the interactions between this regional warming, the nitrogen loading, and water quality. So like I said, we didn't have enough data to really prove, to say causationally what was going on, that warming is causing a lot of these things. And one of the missing pieces that we had was how have nitrogen loads around these estuaries changed over the last several decades that we looked at. So we had a summer student who stayed on as a gap year between an undergraduate and graduate school, who's now at VIMS, Shauna Williamson, who looked at developing sort of time series of nitrogen loading trends for these different estuaries. That's what I'll talk about. So Shauna used a modified version of the Wacoit Bay NLM, which was modified based on a number of the MEP reports and also several other studies that have incorporated direct sources of nitrogen to these coastal systems.
You need to say what NLM.
I'm sorry, that's nitrogen loading model, which is essentially just a bulk nitrogen load model. So it takes information about the land surface. So this would be land use, where we collected data from the USGS. Yes. Lots of citations.
There are 3 nitrogen land models. and this one is easy, more direct to use.
Yeah.
But it's important for people to know that they've all been peer reviewed.
Yes. This was originally published in 1999, I think, 97, 99. Anyway, so we put together sources. This was actually, originally we thought, oh, this is such a great project, and then it turned out to be a lot more challenging than we had originally anticipated, for lack of data, essentially, was largely part of the issue. So we had to compile data from multiple sources on land use information. So we used data from the USGS National Land Cover Data Set, which is a national data source that I think it breaks land use up into 17 or 18 classifications. Also NOAA's Coastal Change Analysis Program, which has sort of more of a wetlands focus to it. Some information, some studies that were done by the Woods Hole Research Center on impervious surface coverage, and also data from MassGIS on both land use and impervious surfaces. It was sort of challenging. Compiling all of these data from a bunch of different sources means that everybody does something a little bit different, and all of the different land use classifications are different. So we worked with sort of a simplification of the land use classifications that were essentially agriculture, residential areas, impervious surface, what were the other ones? So there was 4 natural vegetation, I guess, and open water, essentially, are really the 5 sources that we really, or 5 areas, land use types that we looked at. And rather than using the sort of urban classifications, residential classifications, we decided to do a parcel level analysis. So we used the Massachusetts Level 3 Assessors Database to essentially count how many houses were in each watershed all around Buzzards Bay. And it was very helpful to work with Joe Costa from the Buzzards Bay National Estuary Program, who provided us with really nice maps of sewer history around Buzzards Bay, so we could account for the expanded sewer networks over time that have happened in a number of different places. We also compiled data on atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, which is a very important source, through high-resolution model output from the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. And also had to compile direct wastewater effluent discharge histories from several wastewater treatment plants that are relevant to many of these estuaries. That was actually way more challenging than we had anticipated also. Turns out that there's very little reporting that happened prior to 2006. It's a different database, and the data's not as easily available. And so we had to really compile a lot of old documentation and information from old documents to really put that together, which was frustrating. So Shauna analyzed 27 different estuaries around Buzzards Bay, and this is a complicated plot, and I just put this in to really show, which I'm sure you guys are aware of, that the relative contribution of different nitrogen sources is going to be highly different across the different estuaries, or across the different watersheds, and highly dependent on sort of what's sort of the relative development and or agriculture and the different land use types. So in gray, you're looking at wastewater, white is fertilizer, both on agriculture and on lawns.
This is for one particular year?
No, this is the average across all the years, I'm sorry.
From?
22 years?
1985 to 2013.
So there could have been huge changes in these.
And there are, and I will show you. But this is the average, just sort of a relative contribution across the different estuaries, and those are the Falmouth ones, in case you were wondering. Sippawisset, Quisset Harbor, a combined Squitigue-Magansett Harbor, West Falmouth Harbor, and Wild Harbor. But yeah, you can see that they're highly variable across the different watersheds, with anywhere, with huge differences depending on, like I said, the relative land use and sort of degree of urbanization. We were interested in looking at this because we wanted to see what the trends over time were. And what we were surprised to find was that it was largely driven by the patterns in atmospheric nitrogen deposition. So this is in most places, not all. So this plot is showing you the trends over time. This is sort of complicated, so I'll try to walk you through it. For the 27 different estuaries that Shauna looked at. And what you're looking at is the sort of dots around the circle are telling you whether the overall nitrogen loading changed over time. So the sum of all the different sources, where the dots here are a declining trend, and the solid color on the outside, the bold face, is an increasing trend over time. And if there's no pattern around the outside of this sort of pie chart, there's no change in nitrogen load over time.
What's the difference between blue and red? We can't really.
Getting there. Haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
So the different pies are showing you the relative the contribution of different sources. So the top left here is direct atmospheric deposition onto the estuary surface itself. The bottom left is showing you indirect deposition of atmospheric nitrogen onto the land surface, which is then attenuated before it leaves the estuary. The top right is the wastewater component, which includes both wastewater from septic systems as well as wastewater from treatment plants. And the bottom right is the trends in fertilizer over time. So the color is telling you whether that went up or that went down. So a red is an increasing trend, and a blue is a decreasing trend, and white is no trend at all. Now it's interesting, so just to make sure you guys are aware of this, a trend in indirect incorporates both trends in atmospheric deposition, but also changes in land use. So that would include places where, sorry, let me back up. That would include, changes in urbanization, or increases in impervious surface coverage, or decreases in vegetation. That would incorporate sort of all of that together in one parameter.
So why is?
What's the difference
no,
between
no.
the East Coast and the West?
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Right.
So,
You're messing up over here.
Right. What's the
Sean's
matter
still
with
working
Falmouth?
on making sure that this is in sort of clarifying what's going on. But that was something that we saw that was really interesting, was that these high-resolution models are showing that atmospheric deposition on sort of the western side is decreasing, while atmospheric nitrogen deposition on sort of Cape Cod has stayed stable over time. And I have this plot at the end. I could scroll all the way through and probably show you
They
this.
shut
Maybe I
down a
should do
big
that.
power plant in New Bedford, coal burning power plant.
How many years ago?
This is
They just
1985
they converted to
2013.
natural gas first, and then they just recently shut it off.
But
Well,
I-
there would have been a step change then.
So,
Was there a step change, or was this gradual over?
all right, hold on,
Is
I'm
it-
gonna do,
is it all
hang on a
the way from
second.
Ohio?
One person at a time.
Hang on.
Oh, she's gonna-
Fall River, I'm sorry, it wasn't.
Whatever, right.
So here this is the atmospheric deposition pattern
The breaking
across
point.
the two different halves of Buzzards Bay. So on the top, this is the western side, where it starts off very high and then declines beginning in 2005. And on the eastern side, on Cape Cod, it's pretty much been low and relatively constant over the whole record. Now, it's really interesting, if you look at other work measuring nitrogen in the atmosphere, there was a satellite that went up in the, I think, late 90s, mid 90s maybe, and there was a study that came out this past year that analyzed the satellite, which looks at NOx concentration in the atmosphere, and they found this exact same thing, this exact same pattern for the sort of broader New England area, where beginning in the 2000 and sort of between 2000 and 2005, there was a huge drop-off in NOx concentration in the atmosphere, which they attribute to improvements to, or people following the Clean Air Act, as some of those regulations went into place. So,
So ours didn't go up, but theirs went down.
exactly. All right, now let me get back to where I was.
Switch from coal.
This is very good, Jenny.
Yeah,
Well, there's a lot more to come here.
great.
Hope you guys can bear with me. I was told to be half an hour, but I think it's gonna be a lot more,
Take all
sorry.
the time you want.
Stop the coal, 'cause
Um,
years ago, that-
But yeah, so what we thought was quite interesting was really atmospheric deposition is driving the sort of broader scale pattern in overall nitrogen loading. But if you look at wastewater, which is really the dominant source on Cape Cod, as I'm sure you all are aware, since we really don't have a lot of centralized wastewater infrastructure, that's what's essential, a stable atmospheric nitrogen deposition, plus increases in development and more homes on septic now than they were in the 80s, is really causing this increase in nitrogen load on our side here, compared to sort of the more developed side on the western half of Buzzards Bay, which has a lot more wastewater infrastructure and has expanded quite a lot of sewering over time. So this is really interesting, but we were interested in, okay, well, can we see any climate patterns between the relationships in water quality and the relationships in nitrogen loading? Now, a given estuary, which I should have had an example, and I apologize that I don't, has a pretty narrow range in terms of how far its nitrogen load has declined over time, relative to the sort of range in nitrogen loads around Buzzards Bay. So we sort of analyze things overall, the relationship between nitrogen load and the resulting water quality across all of these different estuaries. So here you're looking at nitrogen load versus, or total nitrogen versus nitrogen load plotted here. And the colors here are temperature. So warmer years are yellow and cooler years are blue. Here you're looking at chlorophyll plotted against nitrogen load again. Same thing with the color scale. Warmer years are yellow and cooler years are blue. There was, of course, a strong relationship between both total nitrogen and chlorophyll and nitrogen load, which is not that surprising. But what we looked at, which was really interesting, was sort of how far do these data points deviate from this relationship? So what's the residual of these, each of these years of data compared to this overall average? And it turns out that total nitrogen how far they deviate from the average relationship is dependent on how warm the water is and how wet that particular year was. So warmer years had more nitrogen, and wetter years had more nitrogen. And if we looked at chlorophyll, as an example, on the other hand, we only found a relationship between temperature. So warmer years had more chlorophyll, but there was no relationship between precipitation and chlorophyll. What we thought was really interesting, which was really telling in terms of our original analysis of the water quality, was that chlorophyll was 5 times more sensitive than total nitrogen to changes in temperature. So for any given change in temperature, there was a 5 times larger change in chlorophyll than there was in total nitrogen. Yep.
I was wondering, when you say chlorophyll, is this a year-round measurements that are average?
No,
or is it just
unfortunately,
summer?
it's not. It's only summertime.
Well, the winter,
So-
the water's pretty clear out there.
It is. It's beautiful out there right now,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, so this is only
Yeah.
summertime measurements, unfortunately.
Okay.
That's actually one of the big questions that we have in terms of the water quality data set is, you know, what do things look like over a year, and what's the seasonality? Because it's also very possible that the seasonality of some things are changing, and we just don't have that information with only summertime measurements.
You're warming the cockles of Ron's heart.
Am I
Hey.
supposed to see some correlation between temperature and location on those graphs?
Location?
Well,
What do you mean by
Well-
location?
you've got complicated graphs here. They're neat. They're fascinating. I mean, you've got the simple geometry of the total nitrogen in one case, or chlorophyll in the other case, versus nitrogen load. That's your graph. You've
Yes.
exaggerated it by the scale.
What do you mean by exaggerated?
Well, you've got 2 orders of magnitude on the horizontal axis and only 1 order of magnitude on the vertical.
Sure.
So it's not really as much as it looks like, right?
Okay.
But then you also have the data points coded by color.
Correct.
And if it's just random, if the color has no relationship to either the X or the Y axis, then so what? But if there was a different curve for different temperatures or different amount of precipitation, then that would be showing us something, wouldn't it?
So it might be a little bit hard to tell for the color scale here, but the mass of yellow is more abundant at the top than the blue. The mass of blue is more abundant at the bottom, or
Okay,
green.
all right.
And it may be a little difficult to see because of the way this color scale is, and also on the big screen. But that, and same as well with the total nitrogen. So the mass of blue is mostly down here, and the mass of greens and yellows is mostly up at the top. Which again, it might be hard to see on this particular image, but that was what we found. So this begs the question then, is if you're working on managing these systems, how do you look forward into the future and say, how are these areas going to change as we go into sort of these future climate possibilities? So the third study that I'm going to talk about is sort of much more broad in terms of the spatial scale. It's regionally looking from essentially Cape Hatteras all through the Gulf of Maine, but looking at what the projected future changes for this whole area is. Or potentially, yeah.
Just before we go to the future, I was wondering, is there any estimate of water exchange rates per, like the volume of the bay per year? How much is kind of somehow pushed out?
I should
Yeah.
have prefaced this. These are nitrogen load estimates per unit volume of each of the estuaries. So this is sort of accounting for the dilution, I suppose, of each of the nitrogen loads as they go into the estuaries.
Maybe moving, I don't know how much, what the net flow is through the Cape Cod Canal or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
However,
I don't have a
yeah.
particular study looking at that, although there would be certainly ways to get at that
Right,
information.
if there is, I don't know, but, yeah. I
You
mean,
know,
it
there's
does
a
go
lot of
back and
people that are
forth.
doing high-resolution hydrodynamic modeling, which it wouldn't
It
be
is.
too challenging to look at that as a, potential loss of nitrogen to the broader sort of southeast New England shelf. Would be a
Right.
way to look at that.
Okay.
Okay, so our projected future changes study. So just to remind you guys of what this sort of change that we've seen historically, both in Buzzards Bay and for the broader region. But again, this begs the question of how are things going to change into the future. So the IPCC are the sort of international group that sort of helps to lead the analysis of future projections for our global climate scenarios, global climate change scenarios. So we were interested in saying, okay, well, what can we do with these global climate projections, and how might this area look under these different future scenarios? So this is sort of a very brief overview of this topic, but the IPCC publishes sort of these standard pathways that are based on carbon dioxide concentration and the relative amount of radiative forcing that's put on the Earth's surface based on atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. That information is then fed into global climate models, which are fully coupled. So the atmosphere interacts with the land and also interacts with the ocean, and then they all interact together, vice versa, to be able to project what future climates might look like. So here, these are our two IPCC pathways, that we looked at. RCP 8.5, which essentially is an increase of radiative forcing to 8.5 by the end of the century, which goes along with an atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration increase from present day, which is roughly 400, I think it was 380 when these were originally done, or 390 when these were originally done, up to 900 to 1,000 by the end of the century. And that's a business as usual scenario. So if nothing changes in terms of our climate policies, and compare that with RCP 4.5, which is a contrasting climate policy scenario where carbon dioxide concentration goes up until about 2050 and then sort of levels off as we increase taxes on carbon emissions, essentially. So these are just published in the IPCC. These are global surface temperature projections. Here, this is the historical part of things, and this is the future projection. Globally, you can see these scenarios are very different. This is actually this is even further down. This is RCP 2.6, but that was what was published in this particular report. RCP 4.5 ends up about here, somewhere halfway between these two. That's not all that important. But you can see that there's differences between these. But there's a high degree of uncertainty around those projections as well, and that's based on different models and different model resolution and different sort of ensembles for where everybody starts. There's about 40 models that go into each of these projections, led by different groups all over the world that incorporate this uncertainty.
Now this one, the real numbers seem to stop around the year 2000, but you have real numbers that go to 2015 now, don't we? On the second chart?
Sorry, this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the IPCC, when the AR5 report came out, which was in 2013, the hindcast, which is going backwards in time, ended in 2005. And all of the models ended at the same time and began their projections in 2006. So that's where the sort of historical data stops at the end of 2005 and the future projections begin. And the reason that happens is because although this report was published in 2013, there was a lot of effort that goes into it, and so those models are churning for years and years beforehand.
But now that we have 10 more years of evidence, does the evidence support either one of these projections?
Yes, in fact, yes, actually. So when this was originally published and these scenarios, the RCP 8.5 scenario was originally published, that was a worst possible case scenario. Everything is terrible, nobody works on emissions control at all. And everyone, the science community essentially said, this is never going to happen. It's, that's really bad case. Well, we're exactly on track to meet that right now. So unfortunately, we're sort of following that worst case scenario as we are right now.
But in 2015, those two curves are still really close to each other.
Yes, in fact, none of the IPCC reports, or none of the IPCC projections differ, in fact, very much until the year 2050. As we are now, we're essentially committed to a certain amount of warming over the next several decades based on what's already been emitted to the atmosphere. And so regardless of what we do in terms of controlling emissions, we're going to have some amount of warming, and that's pretty consistent across all the different projections and all the different models until they start to diverge as we control emissions now. So unfortunately, we're sort of committed to some degree of temperature change globally. But one of the issues and the reason we're doing this is global models do a really bad job of looking at the coastal ocean. In fact, most of the time they don't even resolve the coastal ocean. So these global models are working on sort of at best, a 1 degree resolution, modeling resolution, which, is like the whole of Cape Cod, essentially. So that really doesn't tell us a whole lot about what's going on, or even more, actually, sort of in our coastal waters. And a lot of these models don't even resolve sort of relevant bathymetry for the coastal systems. So in order to take these global projections and understand what's going on in our coastal ocean, and even on the continental shelf, we need to do some sort of methods for downscaling these models to really make them relevant to what's going on locally. So this study downscales low resolution global model output with high resolution measurements. So this is sort of complicated and not all that important, but what I want you to take home is these are the density essentially of measurements that were taken on the continental shelf. These are temperature measurements, CTD casts actually, conductivity, temperature, and depth casts from the 1982 to 2013 period, where there's over 60,000 essentially measurements that have gone into this downscaling results that you'll see. So there's quite a lot of data that goes into this. And the data density is quite good. Sometimes, there's fewer measurements during winter, which is not that surprising since it's logistically really challenging to get out and actually go out in a large vessel and sample these places. But there's really quite a lot of data that goes into this. So we were interested in knowing, well, how are these temperatures going to change regionally under a future climate scenario? So now you're looking at the change in annual mean temperature over from now to the end of the century. 20-year average present day temperature to the 20-year average end of century temperatures. From RCP 8.5, that's that business as usual worst case scenario, compared to RCP 4.5, which is this climate policy scenario. And if you look regionally, of course, the first thing that pops out is there's very different results between these two scenarios, as is expected, because we have a climate policy scenario compared to a business as usual. But also there's differences among the whole region, where the Gulf of Maine really changes a lot more than places further south. It warms a lot more. And how is this relevant to Buzzards Bay? Well, if you look at the data that's closest to Buzzards Bay, which is pulled out from here, this is the hindcast data that you're looking at Buzzards Bay annual temperatures. And here's the future projection for these two climate scenarios. So with these downscaling results, we're projecting an increase in temperature by, annual temperature by about between, roughly 1 to 2 degrees for the RCP 4.5 and 3 to 4 degrees for the RCP 8.5 scenario. This is substantial implications for coastal fisheries. If you think, in particular, for this study, we actually we're interested in looking at potential lobster habitat because lobsters really use these near shore areas for their nursery habitats. And it turns out, which I don't have here on a plot, but essentially all of southern New England becomes inhospitable for lobsters because it becomes far too warm. Although the Gulf of Maine starts to look really nice and much better and in terms of a potential habitat.
Well, they're already loaded with lobsters.
Yes, they are already loaded with lobsters, but these projections are suggesting that it will only get better for the Gulf of Maine and much, much worse for southern New England.
Did you look at oysters?
Haven't looked at oysters, no.
We're very interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
They tolerate a much broader range.
They do. Oysters tolerate a much broader temperature range. Oysters are found anywhere from the Gulf of Mexico all the way, this far north.
Good.
And so I suspect that there would be physiological changes, but perhaps not sort of loss of total habitat under these potential future conditions. Okay, so finally, I'm going to talk about ocean acidification and water quality interactions. This study is ongoing now. We're out collecting data every month, essentially, right now. So this is very preliminary, these results. So take these with a little bit of a grain of salt. So ocean acidification, I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with this, but essentially what happens is increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from emissions, essentially. What you're looking at here is atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration in red, and this was measured in Mauna Loa in Hawaii. A very classic curve here that's been published a number of times. This ended in 2012, this time series, but now it has just kept going. In fact, we hit over 400 ppm recently, in the last year or so, where annual carbon dioxide is over 400. So we've maxed out beyond where this graph is showing you. But what happens is the ocean is a large sink for atmospheric carbon dioxide. So as we emit more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, atmospheric concentration goes up, but also oceanic concentration of carbon dioxide goes up. So in blue here, this is oceanic CO2 as measured nearby the Mauna Loa station in Hawaii. Because of how the chemistry of the ocean, and how sort of carbon dioxide interacts with the chemistry of the ocean, what happens is that pH will go down as a result of increasing carbon dioxide. And you can see that really clearly here. So here in green is pH. As CO2 goes up, pH goes down.
These are actual measurements?
These are actual measurements, yep. These are bottle samples that have been measured near Hawaii. And you can see this from all over the world. I don't have a plot showing you, but in a number of different time series stations, you see the exact same pattern, where as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up, carbon dioxide in the ocean goes up, and the pH goes down because of the way that the carbonate chemistry interacts. I should have put the chemistry on here, sorry about that. But in the open ocean, ocean acidification is largely driven by this atmospheric global scale process. However, in the coastal ocean, things are a little bit different. In the coastal ocean, acidification is much more driven by nutrient pollution than it is by this atmospheric increase in carbon dioxide, which represents sort of a steady pattern, a steady trend in the background, but nutrient pollution is really what drives a lot of acidification in these systems. So if you think about the nutrient pollution problem, with nutrient pollution, you get often these algal blooms, which end up being these large organic matter deposits in these coastal environments. This organic matter is then remineralized. I'm sure if you're familiar with like hypoxia and low oxygen or anoxia, the sort of bacterial remineralization of this organic matter draws down dissolved oxygen in these systems. But on the other side of that equation, they respire, so they're increasing carbon dioxide. So along with these low oxygen and hypoxic events, you also have very high CO2 and acidification events, essentially, that happen in eutrophic systems and places that are nutrient polluted. Along with, one of the reasons that we care about this is because it actually turns out that a number of organisms are very sensitive to acidification, unfortunately. This is showing you a nice study that was done in 2010 where they incubated larval heart clams under different carbon dioxide concentrations. And you can see very clearly that here this is 250, this is 390, which it was present day at the time. This is 750, which is a sort of almost end of century, and 1500 concentration, which is past the end of century if things get worse and don't get better. But you can see very clearly that these clams are getting smaller as the carbon dioxide concentration is getting higher. And why is that happening? So in particular, mollusks appear to be particularly sensitive, calcifiers. So also corals would be very sensitive, or coral and algae. Anybody that's using calcium carbonate as part of their sort of life history and life cycle. And the reason that this is because as you increase carbon dioxide in the seawater, you reduce carbonate ion concentration because of how the chemistry interacts. So if you reduce carbonate ion, animals that use calcium carbonate and make a calcium carbonate shell will not have as much carbonate to be able to do that. And the sort of term that we use, which is based back to chemistry, sort of, college chemistry, is the calcium carbonate saturation state, which is this omega parameter here. which essentially tells you how chemically favorable it is, thermodynamically favorable for calcium carbonate to form. So if it's above 1, this term, it's chemically favorable and calcium carbonate will form. If it's under 1, it means it's more favorable for calcium carbonate to dissolve, essentially, than it is for calcium carbonate to form. So if you look at sort of studies that have been done, meta-analyses that have been done for studies that have essentially tortured these mollusks, they've taken bivalves and incubated them under these different scenarios, future scenarios, it's quite consistent across the board. Mollusks are very sensitive. This was an analysis that was done, a meta-analysis on bivalves specifically, where they took all of the measurements that had been done on adults and looked at the change in rate of growth or calcification and the change in this saturation state parameter, and found that over all of these different species, I think it was 7 species, there was a strong negative relationship. So as saturation state went down, as did growth, as growth went down. If you look at other meta-analyses that have been done, this was a study by Christy Croker in 2009 and then a second one in 2013, that put together sort of a summary of a lot of these studies that have been done. Mollusks in particular, larval forms are the most sensitive, tend to be the most sensitive, but they found that overall there was large reductions in larval survival, especially at the larval stage, in calcification, in growth, and in development, all decreased under ocean acidification scenarios. Now, what's also been found in terms of development is that as these mollusk larvae go through different stages of development, it turns out that if they're incubated under these ocean acidification conditions, the shells essentially are malformed. They don't form. The ones that do survive, if they don't die in the first place, tend to have shells that are very, very deformed. So it's unclear if development is impacted negatively, so if the shells aren't formed as well, since that's sort of the first line of defense, it's unclear right now how that might play out through the system. So maybe those larvae are able to survive, perhaps they don't do as well, or maybe they don't survive at all. It's been challenging for people to sort of keep them growing under these conditions to really be able to say that conclusively, but we suspect that might be the case.
Just a question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, on this, what species were these and where was this done, the studies?
So this analysis looked at, I think 8 published studies that looked at 7 different species from all across the country, all across the world, essentially. In particular, those that are the most sensitive tend to be scallops. Space scallops are quite sensitive, tend to be the most sensitive, in fact. Also, oysters are very sensitive. Oyster larvae are extremely sensitive to changes in the saturation state. There was
Yeah, again, it's species, could be species specific.
It could be species specific, yeah. There's been a lot of work that's been done on the Crustastrea virginica, which is this species, but also on the Pacific oyster as well, that have shown really high degrees of sensitivity for both of the oyster species. I'm happy to send you guys some of that if you're interested in looking into more detail. So on the West Coast in particular, this came up as a problem in 2009. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what happened over there, but what happened was there's a number of oyster hatcheries in Washington State that essentially provided all of the oyster spat for the entire West Coast, all of the oyster aquaculture industry on the West Coast. And in 2009, they unknowingly took up upwelled water that was very high in carbon dioxide into their intake systems for these hatcheries, and essentially wiped out their entire productivity for the entire year. Killed every larvae they had. And it got so bad, actually, that one hatchery even moved to Hawaii to try to avoid these bad conditions. So that really spurred a lot of this ocean acidification research from the get-go at that era, and trying to sort of communicate the issue to aquaculturists around the world that this is a problem that people need to be able to deal with.
How does one part of an estuary have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide than another part? I mean, when you're taking it into your upweller.
So what happened on the West Coast is a little bit different than what happens on the East Coast. On the West Coast, they have an upwelling system, so the wind pattern essentially takes very deep water that's old and has had a lot of respiration that's happened in it and brings it up to the surface. That's why the West Coast is very cold. The waters on the West Coast are often cold. And this particular these hatcheries happen to use the water that was upwelled at the time as part of their intake and run through their system, which essentially killed all of the larvae because it had high CO2. Now, it's not always, conditions aren't always like that, but in this case it was. And so the upwelling on the West Coast sort of exacerbates that problem. Here on this coast, we don't have that as an issue. There's not really upwelling here. So what happens here is that it's nutrient pollution that's really the problem, like I said. So as you have these hypoxic and anoxic events, you also have very high concentrations of carbon dioxide. And I'll show you some data from around Buzzards Bay as well. So we were interested in saying, okay, well, we know all this nutrient history and we have all these nutrient measurements. We're interested in looking at the relationship between nutrient pollution and ocean acidification or coastal acidification here around Buzzards Bay. So we picked 11 representative sites from different estuaries around Buzzards Bay that essentially have the sort of end members of both water quality and estuary type. So our 11 sites are in Westport Rivers. There's 2 sites in each estuary. Westport River, New Bedford Harbor, the Wareham River, West Falmouth Harbor, and Quistit Harbor. And we have one reference site that's out in the middle of Buzzards Bay that gives us sort of the overall Buzzards Bay conditions. Unfortunately, the sort of density of sampling is lower than I would like, but these are not cheap measurements to make, unfortunately. So, we were limited with what our budget would allow. But what we've done is we sampled we sampled the sites in Quistit and West Falmouth Harbors 2 times a summer from June through September. And all of the other sites we sampled once a month from June until present. And Quistit and West Falmouth we've been sampling through now as well. So these guys, we have a higher density of measurements during the summer, and we've lowered it to once a month after the summertime. So these measurements all coincide with times where we were collecting nutrient samples as well, so we can compare the nutrient chemistry to the carbon chemistry and the sort of relative acidity of these places. Although we just got the nutrient chemistry, so haven't gotten that far yet. And we're still collecting these data out through the end of September this year. So this is all still very preliminary.
When did you first start collecting these?
June 2015.
Oh, very recent.
Yeah, this past June. So we've been doing this for 9 months or so. This is sort of an add-on to, I should have shown some data also, but Dan McCorkle at Hui has done a number he's been sampling Waquoit Bay for, I think, maybe 5 or 6 years in a similar manner as this, and has some really nice time series measurements and sort of seasonal history of carbon chemistry in Waquoit Bay. That's very interesting as well, although I don't have it here to show you guys. But so what do some of these data look like? Sorry, I don't have the color scale on here, but this is these data are colored by salinity. So yellow is higher measurements. Yellow is about 32, and blue is more freshwater, so in the 10s or 9s roughly. Here you're looking at carbon dioxide concentration, and this is on a log scale here, so I cut off part of the scale, but so just keep that in mind when you're looking at this. Here, this is the atmospheric equilibrium, which is about 400. So if nothing else was going on, you would expect these oceans or these estuaries to be at about atmospheric equilibrium. Turns out they're not at all, in fact, and they're much higher than atmospheric equilibrium. I just have put this line here as a reference. This was the end of century worst case scenario projection, about 1,000 by the end of the century. So there's a couple things to note here. One, there's variability both within the different times that we've sampled. As I said, we're still doing this at the time. I think now we only have the data processed through the end of September, but we've got samples waiting that are hopefully going to be processed soon that will go through now, present day. But the first thing to notice is that there's variability among the sampling events, but also within a given sampling. So every estuary appears to be behaving quite differently, where if I had these labeled on here, you would see that the center of Buzzards Bay is out here, closest to atmospheric equilibrium. Also, Quistit Harbor is out here. And that's basically because water quality is very pristine. Well, relatively pristine compared to the other places that we were sampling in Quistit Harbor. And then also, the fresher you go in an estuary, the sort of more carbon dioxide that you have. And this is because the more freshwater input you have, the lower the salinity and the lower the alkalinity is. And so the way that the carbon chemistry interacts is that the alkalinity is buffering sort of this carbon dioxide system. So the more alkalinity you have, it tends to be lower PCO2 because of the way the carbon system works.
So is it fair to say that then, if the worst-case scenario takes effect, Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound will be the way the estuaries are now?
Yes. So one thing that is sort of a take-home from this is that as atmospheric carbon dioxide goes up, so does oceanic carbon dioxide. So you can just imagine this whole plot just shifts up over time because the background concentration is going up over time. So what you're seeing here in terms of the increases in carbon dioxide in these coastal systems is largely a biological effect. And I'll show you in a minute some more evidence of that. This is because of coastal biology, because it's so active, biologically active, and there's so much respiration that happens in these systems that these coastal systems have a higher CO2 than the background conditions simply because they're so biologically active. So as atmospheric CO2 goes up, you can just imagine this entire thing just shifting sort of northward. But it's interesting to note that the summertime carbon dioxide is above the worst case scenario in some places. Now, what happens when biology is much less active in the winter, we don't know yet because we haven't processed those samples. So wintertime conditions are still to be determined. If you look at the saturation state, which is that parameter that I was saying is really important for understanding the growth and the relative survival of different bivalve or mollusk species, here is that sort of thermodynamic limit of 1. Here is a critical threshold that was found for those West Coast oyster hatcheries of 1.6 here. So you can see that a number of the places that we sampled this past summer had this critical, or had the saturation state parameter that was much lower than this critical threshold for these oyster hatcheries, but even below this thermodynamic threshold of 1. And that doesn't necessarily mean that these mollusks can't survive. It just means they have to work a lot harder to be able to survive. So many of these species are able to sort of regulate their acid bases within their own tissues and at the calcification surface. But that comes at the cost of having to essentially eat more. It comes at a metabolic cost. So when these conditions are worse, those guys have to work a lot harder, and if food is not available, then they won't be able to survive, essentially. Fortunately, for a lot of these places, food is abundant in a number of these.
Yes.
Yeah,
We
in a
want-
number of places.
We want them
yeah.
to eat more.
Yes. So fortunately, food is quite abundant in these types of places. So they may be able to survive better. But we need more data. We're waiting
There's a
for
limit to food.
what?
Especially if we
There
clean-
is a limit to food.
especially
There
if
is,
we clean
yes.
up the nitrogen.
There is certainly. And, we were really shocked to see that this saturation state parameter was close to 0 for a number of places. And I'll tell you, this is West Falmouth Harbor, for sure. I know that. This is sampling right at the mouth of Massapequa Creek, where that Massapequa
Wow.
Creek meets Snug Harbor.
Right.
So, that's a really, of course, as you know, very poor water quality location, and where SIA's got the new oyster reef that's out there.
But it grows really well.
Yeah, exactly, and it grows really well. And the argument is that there's abundant food available, essentially, that makes it so these oysters that are out there can survive under these conditions and do actually quite well, which is very different from what people have found in laboratory studies. They've found that there is a food effect, but it doesn't seem to be as abundant as what we're seeing in these field conditions.
So this is a really good experiment that we're
Yes.
doing this
Yes.
summer. And in fact, Jenny's group is the monitoring, they were the partners, as you may recall,
Right.
for the SNAP grant that we received, and their monitoring is as part of the match that.
Nice.
Right.
Yes, so
So,
I'm
very
excited
excited.
to start looking at some of these things in more detail this summer.
Does this mean we have to keep the nitrogen coming?
No, I would argue no, because if you reduce the nitrogen, then the overall conditions are just going to get better. They're going to become chemically better. and less stressful for these organisms.
Well, the shells are 44% CO2 anyway.
They
So
are.
they're sequestering CO2.
They are sequestering carbon, yep.
What about, I don't know much about volatilization of CO2. Is there in terms of,
Are you talking about air-sea exchange?
yeah.
So certainly these places that are far higher than atmospheric equilibrium are going to be degassing CO2 to the atmosphere, absolutely. So these guys are going to be sources of CO2 to the atmosphere, adding to emissions,
Right.
essentially. And that's not uncommon for estuaries in general. There's been a number of studies that have looked at sort of net metabolism in estuaries and found that they tend to be heterotrophic, at least in temperate systems. It depends on sort of what the dominant primary producer is of these systems as well. If you have things that are really quite productive, like seagrasses, you may end up having sort of a different type of system that may be autotrophic for at least part of the year. But it's not uncommon for these sort of really eutrophic estuaries to be heterotrophic and having a net release of CO2.
And just another point is that if you're taking out the plankton, basically, then you're pulling out the CO2 because it's going into growth, right?
So you're pulling out the nitrogen.
Nitrogen and, well, there's carbon in the
Sure.
from growth, right? So you're pulling that all of that out, and if it's a constant process.
So, except
Then
the
some.
calcification process uses carbonate ion, not carbon dioxide. And so
Right.
actually, because I don't have the equation on here, but because of the way the chemical equation for the equilibrium of the different forms of inorganic carbon in seawater, the calcification process actually produces CO2. So when you take out a carbonate ion, it shifts the equilibrium over and produces a carbon dioxide, unfortunately. So the calcification process actually doesn't help reduce the CO2 in these systems. It actually can make it worse, depending on sort of ecosystem level processes.
Yeah, I have to think about that for a bit.
Great.
You gotta sink, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, again, these are colored by salinity as well. So you can see the saltier places have a higher saturation state, and that's because they have they tend to have higher alkalinity as well, which again is part of that equilibrium in the inorganic carbon system in seawater. But this might suggest that although food availability is very high in these places that have this really poor chemical conditions, it may be sort of chemically better for oysters and other bivalves or other mollusks to grow in sort of the more salty side of the estuary rather than the sort of freshwater side of things.
Except for predation. Except for predation.
Yeah, that could be a problem too. And if you look at pH as well, these are the pH data over the same record. Sort of the normal open ocean or normal sort of unpolluted estuarine conditions are roughly somewhere between 7.8 and 8 probably, or 8.1 depending on where you are. And here you can see that the pH in many of these places is much lower than what you might consider normal, and that's roughly what's expected for the open ocean by the end of the century. So you can see again the acidity of these places is a lot higher. And just to show you, this is largely biologically mediated. Here you're looking at dissolved oxygen on the x-axis and pH on the y-axis, and you can see there's a very strong correlation. I'm not sure what's going on with those two data points, but there's a very strong correlation between dissolved oxygen concentration and pH. So as the system, or as microbes in these estuaries are drawing down dissolved oxygen, they're increasing carbon dioxide, which reduces the pH. So this is really biologically driven. All of these patterns that we're seeing here it's all biologically driven, and it's largely driven by this nutrient pollution problem. Like I said, if you go back to here, what you see, these guys that are sort of as close to atmospheric equilibrium as you can be on these different samplings, it's Quistit Harbor and the open waters of Buzzards Bay, which are much, much less sort of polluted than other places. So with that, I think I'm done.
Oh, yay.
That was tremendous,
An
really.
hour. Sorry about that. So yeah, if you guys have any other questions, I've sort of been answering them as you go along, but.
Yeah, any other questions?
No, just the last graph you had looked like the story's photosynthesis to me.
Yep.
Looks like
Right.
one.
It could-
The
it's-
story is photosynthesis, but you're,
Running out of juice here. Is there?
but again, it's,
Running out of what? Oh,
Power.
why?
Well,
They're not plugged in.
oh,
It could certainly be photosynthesis, and in
Yeah.
fact, that's something that I should note. Most of these measurements were made in the morning. So they were made after a night of darkness where photosynthesis wouldn't be happening, and so respiration would be the dominant process.
well,
So
it depends what time of the day.
exactly, it could depend on the time of day, and in
If it's-
fact,
If it's 9 o'clock every day,
Yep.
some days you're 3 hours into sunlight.
sure,
so-
sure. But we did, as we were concerned about that being a bias, in fact, measuring only in the morning after a period of darkness. So we did some test.
Don't mind me.
We did some test measurements of samples during both the morning and then after a long period of light in the evening, and there was a bias in the data. So the conditions look a bit better in the evening than they do in the morning after a long period of photosynthesis has happened. So there's uptake of that carbon dioxide rather than release from respiration. But what's important to note is that these conditions are sort of what we're looking at are part of the worst case scenario, what these organisms are experiencing. And what we don't know, really in the scientific community in general, is that, how do these guys respond to this daily, up and down fluctuation of pH and these carbon system parameters that you see because of this high degree of photosynthesis and respiration that happens in these eutrophic systems. That's something that we still don't know. And the field of ocean acidification research is relatively young. It's only about a decade old. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions to be addressed.
good. Steve?
Great presentation, thank
Thanks.
you. The biggest take-home for me is how large all the standard deviations are compared to the trends, which I'm hoping you can comment on this. That means for us, when we do some intervention in one estuary, and we don't have we can't do what you do of collecting data from all over Buzzards Bay or all over the world. I mean, we could steal your data, but it wouldn't
Well, some
do
of
us
this,
any good for one particular estuary.
I will say most of this is the Buzzards Bay Coalition's
But-
data.
but
So
I'm
we
just
stole
being
some
silly
of
there.
this. Yeah.
But I'm distracting you. But it means that when we do an intervention in one particular estuary, it'll be hard for us to draw a conclusion unless we wait a number of years
Yes.
or have some clever kind of control.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the reasons why we are able to tease apart so much in terms of these broader scale patterns is because there is such a huge degree of variability across these different estuaries that have very different sort of nutrient loading rates and relative degrees of pollution. And so we can look across sort of this nutrient pollution gradient from relatively pristine to very polluted and see these broad scale patterns. Whereas if you're looking within a single estuary, you're exactly right, it would take a long time potentially to be able to tease apart these trends and patterns.
But I think that on that too is that we're not, as you said, in the lab studies, they don't correlate to the field stuff, at least in terms of West Falmouth Harbor. We have weather, and we have cloudy summers, and we have
Sure.
sunny summers, just on a day-to-day basis, if you have a sunny day versus a cloudy day, there's a huge deviation.
Absolutely.
In what's happening, as you said, because it's biologically driven. So it is something that there can be patterns. That's why 1 year studies, sometimes we say, let's get baseline data. Well,
Yeah,
the thing
that's not
is
really
that-
baseline, exactly.
is that the baseline could be misleading.
Yes, absolutely. So along with the same idea of having this huge degree of variability across the data, there's also a huge degree of interannual variability. That's exactly right. So that, if you look at, for example, 2012, which was one of the warmest, well, at the time it was one of the warmest years on record. Now, this past year was, but the conditions were warmer than had ever been measured before. In fact, were several degrees deviation from what was before, and then the year right after that was quite cool, relatively speaking. So in terms of both temperature and precipitation patterns, there's a huge amount of interannual variability, which really speaks to the fact of supporting long-term monitoring in particular, because in order to really be able to develop these trends and understand what the baseline conditions are, you need to be able to monitor over a very long period of time to really be able to say, okay, this actually is the baseline, because of that interannual
I
variability.
think the monitoring is great, but the modeling is probably even more, because you find out really quickly what you don't know.
Yes.
Because you see, if you can't simulate it,
Yes.
then you have to go back and check the, try
Yes,
to tweak
absolutely.
things.
And in
yeah.
fact, when modeling studies are commissioned, most of the time, one of the earliest results that they find is what's missing, and the information that's missing in terms of being able to predict these types of responses.
Right.
Which is kind of cool about the MEP model, that they actually used the model and collected the data to be able to run the model.
Yes.
I mean, that's what's great about the MEPs, that
Yeah.
they did that. They knew that they wanted to have a model, so they collected all the data, and all the monitoring stations are specifically located in the grid of, their nodes, so that they would know if their model was working. So that was
As
kind
far
of a
as
cool
we
thing.
can see, though, they have a phantom model, because no one's been able to look at it except for them.
It's RMA2 and RMA4. It's actually published. I mean, you can go look at RMA2 and RMA4.
Eventually get beyond that.
Yeah.
Yes, we spent a few years on it.
Well, I haven't seen it.
Any other comments or questions from the committee or our associate
Rich.
committee here? No, thank you very
Thank you.
much. This is,
Thanks
this
so much
was
for coming.
Terrific,
Oh, absolutely, anytime.
And so pertinent.
yes.
We're indebted to all of the research that's going on right now.
Oh, that's great.
So we can
I'm
build this to a-
very excited to be doing it and to be part of it here, so it's really nice. Especially to be part of a community that's very understanding of these types of issues, that are very relevant in everybody's backyard.
Yes.
It's something that's nice.
No question. No, we
Great.
are.
All right.
Thank you.
I couldn't find the power cord
So
on
does
that.
that mean we should keep
That's
the
all
wind
right.
turbines running?
Give me a couple of quick things here, I think. The 208 watershed report. This was sent around. You all got a copy of what the Cape Cod Commission staff came here a couple of days ago and met with Steve and Virginia and myself just to show their wares, which is what was sent around. And either Steve or Virginia or Sia want to make any comment about that?
I think we want to say that this is something that the commission feels that they have to do for all of the 53 estuaries on the Cape. To me, it's sort of like check off the boxes. It's not a plan. It's a report. It's basically using their models and their tools as they went through what they called the template, and that's what we emailed to all of you. Just based on our own experience here in Falmouth, we were able to point out some ways that might make these scenarios somewhat more realistic. But they are all conceptual. They are not plans. We were told that the 208 plan as a whole requires that these reports be filed by the end of June as something that they agreed to with the state and the DEP. As you know, this committee has already sort of reviewed each one of all of the estuaries in addition to the ones that were done on the south coast under the CWMP. So SIA is going to meet with them next week and go through Rand's Canal and Meganson Harbor and sort of provide our current information and our thinking on those various estuaries. Where we actually go from here, this is their work product. It's not the committee's work product, and it's not really the town of Falmouth's, it's not the town of Falmouth's plan. But it would be a standard way of presenting information on each of the estuaries, and apparently the commission feels that they have to do that and that it's useful. So that's sort of where we are at this point. Whether it comes back as an agenda item for us to either discuss or agree or disagree with, I'm sort of going to wait until SIA's had this meeting, and it's a fairly lengthy meeting. As our SIA is most of the day, right?
The plan is to have a working session. Where this committee has gone through each of the watersheds. We've had PowerPoints, we've done the summary reports, and I was basically going to make the commission aware of what the committee's thinking has already been. What the commission is doing are what are called bookends. So they're coming up with a non-traditional scenario for how you would remove the amount of nitrogen using all non-traditional, and then a traditional scenario. And I think we've done that and looked at what we call a hybrid approach, which included what can you get with non-traditional, and then what would you need in terms of IA systems, and that kind of thing. So I think in informing them about what our practically what we understand about our estuaries and what some of the opportunities are for stormwater and things like that is going to be pretty much a day of presenting to them so that they can take notes, and then when they come up with their watershed report on the non-traditional side and on the traditional side, they'll understand what we know at a greater level of detail than they could know. I mean, they can't, it's not that they don't know it, they're not able to look at the same level of specificity. And then, there may be opportunities that they've noticed for things like fertigation that
Which most people don't know what that
What
means.
Right.
So fertigation is when you take groundwater and you use that nitrogen groundwater to fertilize things like golf courses and ball fields. So it's using irrigated water for fertilizer and getting some nutrient benefit. So if there are places where they've said, this golf course could be a candidate for this, we could then look at it. So there may be some things that we haven't seen, but mostly it's for them to understand where we've already gone.
Steve?
I agree with all that, and I also, the most encouraging thing to me was that they seemed to be very receptive to listening to our knowledge. I think a lot of people, some people before.
Some of our knowledge.
They have their
Yeah.
constraints on their format, but I think they realize they can learn a lot from us. Which was
Some
much
of
more
us.
encouraging than some people in Falmouth had thought that this was something that would be imposed on us by the county, and I didn't hear that.
No, there's no danger of that. I think they do have a lot to learn, because we have gotten down into the weeds on these estuaries, and they are 30,000 feet up, looking at a model. So I think your conversations with them will be helpful for them.
Very much so.
Any other comments or questions about that? Okay, report of members and staff. What else we got? John?
Thank
I
you, Brenda.
attended,
Yes.
Julian.
Thank you, Brenda. Oh, yeah.
The town manager started the process of thinking about that shellfish aquaculture working group, held the first meeting last Thursday evening at 6:30. There were about 6 of us there, Chuck Martinson, Jen from Conservation, Julian, myself, Doug Jones, and we basically set up a process for that. So the next meeting is going to be on May 19th, again at 6:30, it's a Thursday evening. They're going to invite about 12 people to be on the committee, the working group initially. So people from a commercial shellfish, a recreational shellfish person, a senior citizen shellfish person, a grant holder, someone from the Water Quality Committee, someone from Coastal Ponds, someone from Waterways, Jen from Concom, Chuck from Natural Resources, someone from Aquaculture, Doug Jones, and Julian. And the idea was before the next meeting, they were going to write, Julian and Chuck, I believe, were going to write an RFP to put out for the consultant that they wanted to hire to help them. At the next meeting, they were going to try and sit down and write a mission statement. And Chuck was going to give them a presentation of what was regulatory possible at the moment. So they had a baseline to know where they could start. And then the thought was, after the working group had an iteration of what they thought was possible, they would bring in the other stakeholders, waterways and the beach people and the people that around the ponds, who would then comment on what the group had put together. And I think they were thinking that it was going to be about a year's process to put that together.
Good.
Oh, the other piece that was important, and I'm not sure it happened, Doug Jones, they decided that until this process is completed, there should be a moratorium on what was going to be happening in the coastal ponds.
So they're recommending that to the selectmen?
Doug was supposed to bring that to the, I believe, the May 5th or 6th meeting. I'm not sure where that is, but that was what he left the meeting.
You mean
That's
just
his
commercial
choice.
things, or what if you want to do a reef experiment for water quality committee?
Not beginning to have a land grab for the coastal.
Aquaculture. Aquaculture.
Aquaculture, right.
So commercial guys can still dig, but the setting up private aquaculture leases, the moratorium on private
grants.
aquaculture leases, I
And you
think
can
that's.
still
what-
do reefs if you want.
Yeah, I'm sure. Any other comments or questions about that? No. Any other reports of members and staff?
On the Shorewood parcel where we have the permeable reactive barrier, all of the wells are in, and they're doing their first round of sampling. A month from now, they'll do the second round of sampling. So everything's on track for that. On Bourne's Pond, I forwarded to you the document that's, excuse me, one of the many regulatory and procedural things that have to be done. This was just a modification to the DRI, Development of Regional Impact, document for the Cape Cod Commission. And the engineers are working on the submittal to the Conservation Commission, and I'm not sure exactly where they are in that process.
Any comments or questions? Ron?
I just have two things. Actually, John and I both attended a meeting a couple nights ago that was at Webner, Coit Bay, Estuary Research Reserve. There was a talk by Dan Rogers from Stonehill College about nitrogen and oyster production, or aquaculture. And the discussion, his focus was, well, mostly looking at, he's I think a geochemist, and he was looking at the denitrification and of on the basis of per gram of sediment, associated sediment, yeah, underneath.
So denitrification.
And, yeah, and then he was looking at, he plans to look at, and it was done in Little Pond, West Falmouth Harbor, Little Pond with the floating culture, West Falmouth Harbor with bottom racks, and in Wellfleet under the kind of raised rack bag cage system that they do there. He was looking and doing comparison of the various aspects. He plans to continue with that. So that was interesting. He's also looking at something called, I think it's an Ammonox reaction, which might be another associated pathway by which nitrogen is removed in association with the shellfish. So it's both denitrification and that, and then what goes into the animals. He also has data, we all have that data, at least. And the other is that there have been two meetings now on, that's somewhat related to our work, but on the grinder pump policy development. And there was good attendance by neighborhood people, by the town administration, Ray Jack, and even Jerry was there as well, and Julian led it, and I think Doug and Sam Doug Jones and Sam Patterson, selectmen, were at least one of the meetings. I only went to the first one, but and it seems that they're coming up with a recommendation that will greatly help the enormous cost that the households otherwise would have to carry with regard to this, which exceeded any estimates so far, but it's all preliminary. But they, both in terms of hookup costs and the emergency power aspect of what happens. So it's and it looks like it, from what I've heard, it seems that it's moving in a direction that will help the neighbors, or the quite a bit with that, through either directly by the town or by a third party with regard to power.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Any other reports or questions or comments or?
Just a
Matt?
quick comment, I heard from a local plumber that he's able to put 12 homes on one grinder pump. I guess it's a bigger grinder pump, but he's saving people money doing that.
And that's okay with the plumbing department here? That would,
It has to,
Nice.
yeah, Fran Smith, Patent Plumbing.
So then he has to run a pipe parallel to the main.
I don't know how he's
Oh, to
doing
feed
it.
them
No,
all
no,
in.
the pump would go to the main, and then the feeder lines would go to each of the houses to the pump.
Yeah, but if you picture 12 houses along the street,
Hmm.
even if you have 6 of them on one side and 6 on the other, normally they just have piping, I think, maximum out to the main, right?
Yep.
Now they also have to go sideways to get to the pump.
Well, it depends.
But
Well,
it
they don't
might
have to
be a
get to the main,
cul-de-sac. You don't, until you know where he's
Yeah.
building this.
Yes, that would be a magical.
And then-
place.
and
He
then-
You're in a
did
circle.
show it to the engineer, and the engineer said, yeah, of course, we can do that.
well,
That
and
is
that's
possible.
Well, that's really neat.
Yeah.
great. Okay, a vote on minutes of prior meeting. They were sent around.
Late, they were sent around late, so
You
I'm
know, we're
not
not
sure.
going to worry about that unless someone objects to the fact they were sent around late. Hearing no objection, any comments or questions or additions or amendments to the minutes?
I didn't have time to review it in detail, but what I did see, I need to recommend a change, but I can't do it tonight.
All right, then we won't take them up.
Well, hold on.
Next question would be, our next meeting, May 5th is next week, and I'm not sure we need a meeting in a week. Is there a sense that we could wait till the 19th?
Well, we don't know I don't know what's going on.
Okay.
so.
The only thing I would say is that we just got an email that the National Estuaries Project has a funding round.
Oh, okay,
It's due June 2nd.
right, and we would have to do it, and the selectmen would have to do it before it went to them.
Right.
So we might need one. Okay, well, let's,
It could be
plan
a
on-
short one.
yeah,
Let's plan on one.
Let's plan on it, but we'll let you know if there's no reason to do it, or
And it
if there
really
is.
depends on if we come up with, if the stream nitrogen removal working group comes up with.
Well, we will come up with something that at least some of us on the working group would like you to write an application for, right? Including you.
Sure. And so
And I think
so we
we've
should
got-
probably.
And we
Okay.
need the approval of this
Right,
committee.
okay,
Yes.
okay.
Even for her to spend her time writing it, I assume?
No.
No? Just to submit it?
Just, well, it would come here and then to the selectmen, but, you know, she'll.
But it's a pretty short time frame,
Yeah,
so I would
okay.
say we
So maybe
should
we shouldn't have to meet.
we
Okay.
should plan on meeting, and
Okay.
I'm certainly not going to be doing any writing between now and Thursday. I can just assure
Right.
you with that. I have other responsibilities, so
Okay.
so Thursday would be a good time to decide if the committee wants us to go ahead and write something for June 2nd, and then
Mm-hmm.
get on the selectmen's agenda.
Okay, all right, well, unless you hear different, we're on for the 5th. You got a motion for me, Matt?
I move, we adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Second?
Moved and seconded, any discussion, all in favor, say aye.
All right.
All right.